civilization that gave to all humankind values, important values, and the geopolitical position was a place of communication, spiritual and material, between Asia, Europe, and Africa, and their great civilizations, as well as their religious trends. At the same time, it was the theater for many conflicts, not only on ideological and spiritual level, but also on a political level. The revolution itself was a historical event of great importance, that different religious traditions were in conflict, but also political systems and ideological worldviews, as well as social powers with influence that brought about changes in the rest of Europe, the Balkans, and the then East Mediterranean that was under Ottoman occupation. The great question that is posed in this context of this meeting is what will the role be of the Church and its relation with the state during the secularization era. We do know that Church and state, according to the Constitution, distinct roles. In Europe, only one country, France, as it is known, has an absolute system of separation that has problems that French themselves have placed under discussion. Every other country have systems of relationship that represent their historical route and their special conditions. In this great family of European countries, that is the majority, Greece, of course, belongs. We're not European. We are part of the European rule. It's also a fact that the Greek people relates their identity with their spiritual tradition. This was evident from presentations during the previous fora. Every religious group have the same views when it comes to religious issues. So the state has to explain to the non-religious people why it follows the specific taxation policy for these communities. Of course, the state's position will not be so difficult, will not be more difficult than Belgium, for example, or Germany, that spends large sums of money to the for the Catholic Church for lands that missed even before its creation. It's not so different what happens in Greece and what happens in certain Scandinavian countries. The relations of state and church in Greece are dynamics and keep changing. It will keep changing for the next years, as it is natural. But the special relationship between Hellenism and Orthodoxy will remain stable. Based on the above mentioned thoughts and celebrating the bicentennial anniversary of 1821, the Academy of Theological Studies has organized two fora. The first one in Athens on September the 6th, with the topic Us and the Other, Facts and Perspectives for Hellenism and Orthodoxy. And the second forum took place last week, the formation of Hellenic identity in Greece today and tomorrow. Today, here in Thessaloniki, the third round table takes place with the title Secularization of the State and Society and the Westerness of the Church. The last round forum will take place next Monday in Alexandroupolis. Today's presenters, I wish to welcome them and thank them for accepting the invitation, is Reverend Theodosios Martzouchos, the theologian, a priest of the Holy Metropolis of Preveza. We are connected with a strong friendship, and I thank him once again for being here in our discussion. Dr. Aris Stylianou, professor and president at the School of Political Sciences at the Faculty of Economic and Political Sciences at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Dr. Grace Davie, professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. And last, Dr. Pantelis Kalaitzidis, director of Volos Academy for Theological Studies, and member of the Executive Committee of the European Academy of Religion. I welcome them once again, as all of you. We'll follow the presentations as they were last heard by name. You can use Father Theodosios the podium. You will have 15 to 20 minutes. I would like to thank everyone who is here and the Academy of Theological Studies in Volos, that is His Eminence Metropolitan Demetrias Stylianou, and the Director, Dr. Pantelis Kalaitzidis, for the invitation in this round table on the occasion of the thematic development in today of the fruits of the Hellenic Revolution in 1821. The rollers, of course, of our ancestors, when they dry up, entail the danger of a fire that can consume those who sit on them. But these activities, such as the ones from Volos Academy, keep live and last as laurels. My participation in today's roundtable will not have the elements of a historical quest and presentation of aspects of the multifaceted past of the 400 years, but today's contemporary clerical view of what came as results in the historical course of the mystery of the Church. But contemporary clerical view of what came as results in the historical course of the mystery of the Church those years, again, not as instances, but as periodic notions. The past in two paragraphs. I will start with the first and the last paragraph of the book of Sir Stephen Runciman in his book, The Great Church in Captivity. He writes, the Patriarchate of Constantinople did not recover from the events of 1821. The Patriarch remained the head of the Orthodox Millet, but his administration was under closer supervision and his authorities were steadily restricted. He could still, back in 1908, to present in the opening of the parliament, where Sultan Abdul Hamid had to convene, along with the hierarchs, as a higher official of the Ottoman Empire. But the triumphant Young Turks did not need the system of the Millet, and they were designing its abolishment. The victory of the Allies in 1918 gave hopes in the patriarchal cycles, but they never hoped they would be given its previous authorities to the Patriarchate, but rather that Constantinople would be given to the Greeks as the realization of the great idea. The hope was pointless and was destroyed by the genius of Kemal Atatürk. The Greek defeat in Asia Minor meant the Turks would recover Constantinople, and the understanding of Atatürk on government provided no space for the Millet. Since then, Patriarch's authority was clearly ecclesiastical. He just became an archbishop of a waning religious community in a secular state whose governments mistrusted him and disliked him both for its faith and its race. His flock, that was limited in Turkey, in Istanbul, the name Constantinople was abolished, and its suburbs. The flock could look to him just for ethical guidance and spiritual consolation. This is the first paragraph. The second paragraph. The history of the Orthodox Patriarchate during the long captivity of the Great Church does not have any heroic challenges. Its leadership were people who considered wise to move away from the public eye, from the magnificent and grand gestures. If they often slipped into plotting and sometimes in corruption, that was the unavoidable fate of the second-class citizens under a government in which scheming and corruption flourish. The great accomplishment of the Patriarchate was that, despite the humiliation, poverty, and disdain, the Church endured and preserved its spiritual power. The torch was dark and had no light any longer, as the English Peter Heylin, who disliked the Greeks, mentioned in the beginning of the 17th century, but the God never let them. The light still burns and is even glorious, and the hate's gate cannot be overpowered. In the above text, this great historian, researcher, and person had two issues that we have to respond. The first paragraph is a description of the stripping of the Patriarchate of every kind of power and authority, and a highlighting that the only activities in the Patriarchate was only the ethical guidance and the spiritual consolation. Is the historian mourning? But do Christians also have to mourn, especially the clergy? Is there for the clergy a greater work from spiritual guidance? Let us not complicate it any more. We talk about the Christian ethos, the quality that is spreads in the atmosphere by the life of the Christians. If the world and life is a mystery, have all these years been a breakdown from the illusions, from the prestige and authority and omnipotence, and even from the greater illusion that we are the beloved children of God? Even today, after all the defeats that we have inferred, many of our brothers are sad and anticipate in delusion the restoring of the ancient Byzantine beauty, looks forward to prophecies old and new for the political resurrection of the race, forgetting that the Christian class was born and was glorified in the dark catacombs. The second paragraph concludes, after an honest and painful evaluation of the quality of the clergy, that despite this quality, the light was still burning, and hate's gates cannot overpower it. Of course, we do not expect from the historian a theological analysis of the word of Christ for the construction of the church on the confession of Peter, "You are Christ, the Son of the living God," which the gates of hate cannot recant. But the synodal voting of the Fifth Synod and following Saint Cyril of Alexandria explains that the gates of hate are the heretics' deadly words. That is, that the word is not about the history, but theology. That is, that the church is destroyed by lie in teaching, in the quality of life, in the subjugation of politics, a lie that separates from him who is the truth. Historical shapes, even from local churches, pass by and disappear. The agony of Christ is not that historical schemes are destroyed, but souls may not be lost in the deprivation of lie. For these souls that died, and not historically, in our era, we have the qualification, in quotes, of the logical conclusion for all of the above. We have in front of our eyes the historical extinction of the churches of Mauritania, Persia, the churches of Revelation. And of course, we can clearly realize what he does mean what Christ means when he says the gates of Hades. Church opens great routes during the Ottoman occupation. We are altogether a church. First of all, the lay people and then the clergy, because the clergy comes from the lay people. But the clergy is not an administrative bureaucracy, but a pastoral care, has the first saying for the course of the body. The correspondence of the route of the people's God in Sinai is archetypical, is also for the passing on the desert, through the desert of Ottoman occupation. Moses in Sinai, with the help of the elder, deals with current issues. The Patriarch in Constantinople during the Ottoman occupation, along with the Synod, decided for the way of life of the Christians among people of different faith who were the oppressive tyrants. When Constantine Palaiologos closed his eyes, killed on the walls of the city he was defending, with him the political entity of that city closed, the historical entity and presence continued and still continues its course, but now with different conveyors and other content, and with the former constructors and inhabitants not being inhabitants but decadent slaves, second-class citizens. Of course, history is not a series of events. It's first and foremost the presence of people. It's a dialogue with what happened. Where we are is not constructed by us, either when we like it or not. It was dug, in quotes, all those who have passed by the skin of their teeth, but also for the consideration in their blood. The past creates our cosmological origins. The past reveals and demarcates. With the knowledge of what it was expressed and demarcated, Constantinople, responsible for the millet of the Christians, Patriarch Ignatius, fought to rescue the nation from the dissolving tendency that came after the fall. When someone loses, there's also the danger of self-abandonment and indifference and the loss of any meaning of life other than the sense of survival. Ignatius denied every new choice of cultural prototype. For example, the Emiruti's suggestion for Islamization, Plithon for Hellenization, and the suggestion of Vissarion for Westernization. And he took up the responsibilities of the painful here and now with bravery. He said, so that the nation Hellenism will be rescued only if it kept its faith and its education, and took advantage of his position, millet-basis, and the admiration of Mohammed the Destroyer for his faith. He established an academy to continue the work of the University of Constantinople. Ignatius set the foundations for the patriarchal policy that aimed to the preservation of the faith and for the inner conquest of the Turkish Empire based on the thinking of Hellenization of the Roman Empire. This second thing has never succeeded, but this is not something to be discussed now. Today, we can all talk about all this. We exist because all these people existed after Ignatius, clergy and lay people. Many of them might have been inferior of the occasions, as Runciman says, but the aim was shaped and the pursuit was obvious. Maybe society had turned into a collectivity, but the common good was the altar in which countless victims were offered, that offered other people a reason to live. There was an absolute distinction of life from simply pure survival. Subjectivity was a leprosy that whoever got it died for the nation. If we exist today as people, as language, as conscious, we owe it to these conveyors and fighters for the Orthodox faith. Clearly only to Orthodoxy, and we can talk about achievements or defeats, glories or dishonesties, as and in our language, not just historians and the libraries, as researchers of peoples who was lost in the waves of history. Let's move to today. It happens in our days for us to listen, Jesus, yes, church, no. Church is not the be-all and end-of-all. It serves the purpose, which is the meeting with God, has no other reason for existence, another role than to promote this aim. The aim of Christ, when he establishes church, is to make us know God. In a few words, church is Christ's gift to humanity. The evolution of today's world has led to go through a crisis or being questions the traditional institutions, of course, church being the first, that constructs social coexistence. Is it really that bad? It's not so sure. As solidarity is based on blood, in group, in race, or even to the fact of a common life, is a legal, limited form of solidarity. Today, that the emphasis is placed on person, we are called to find freely new forms of solidarity. Maybe it's a disadvantage that we may not have solidarity, but the huge advantage is that we can freely have or not have. To us is left the possibility to say, without something like that being imposed on that we should be solidary. How do we construct this form of solidarity? We have to cultivate love for the present, that is, the love for God's today. We cannot love our neighbor if we don't love the time in which we live. Today is, of course, ephemeral, but it's the only instance that we can do something. Defamation of the present means necessarily the defamation of the persons, is what we usually listen. People do not understand anything, they are not as they were supposed to be, and many other things. We have to have the capability as Christians to discern how the Holy Spirit lights today's world, that is actively working even today. We have to construct a future, not in fear, but in love. Our role through the Eucharist is to construct a real body of Christ with these othernesses. Citizenship in church is the baptism and is given only through baptism. Through baptism, everyone is an original citizen, not by descent. Our role is to say to everyone that's a citizen of the church, a citizen of heaven, exactly as those people are, with the culture, today's culture, tomorrow's culture. The church is called to play the role of a laboratory, within quotes, in this cohabitation, coexistence that is constructed. We have to seek and cultivate the small things. At the end of the divine liturgy, we do not send people to their home with a specific plan of action, but we tell them, you can go in peace. Go in Christ's peace. It is the internal peace of the transformed heart, the peace that makes us more careful towards today, without predefined plans, open to any meeting with anyone. It is very important for us to live in this active and open peace that has to meet the power, dynamism of people. This happens in unexpected ways. The church is called to open roads and announce the gospel in new ways in a world that every day all the more alienates from the gospel and the church. The church is called to bring into contact contemporary world with the life-giving and the eternal power of the gospel, the Aris, the essential cell of the life of the church, in which cell it is called the homeless, spiritually homeless person is called to connect with. And this is the first and foremost and of great importance, because today not many people realize the importance of the mission of the church. Sometimes they have many traumatic experiences from the clergy, and they are not even inclined to accept suggestions. Without the incarnated reality of the parish, the church is in danger to become an institution, offices, administrative organization, that the larger it gets, even if it is very modern, then the less space leaves for the Spirit of God, to Christ, and to the freedom that is created by His truth. And in the pandemic of immigration, when the foreigner is read as danger, then even the mission of the church is dead, crushed under the ruins created by indifference, and in the contemporary version, the politically correct reading of coexistence. But we can be sure for the possibility to construct the body of Christ, because Christ deleted and killed, hatred. If we accept his spirit, it is possible to accept that. A segregated society could never be able to satisfy the baptized person. The question now we have is, what is the position that holds in contemporary society Church of Christians in connection with other religions? Many religious communities preach with honesty and the peace. The peculiarity of the Christians is that now they cannot and they should not connect the gospel with a specific culture. Of course, we express through our own culture, but we shouldn't forget but know that we are all foreigners. We have to have this awareness of foreign, following the real foreigner with a capital F. We should realize that we are foreigners ourselves, that we were accepted by him and by his people. There's no culture that can be called culture of Christ. Every local church started with and from and with idolaters, and we should seek the hope that gives the courage to someone to be offered. I will finish with two small parts from a writer from Constantinople that died 45 years ago, Yorgos Theotokos. He is very clear and frank on what he sees. This is what we should also do. Yorgos Theotokos, this feeling of power and of spiritual and local, has been standing for many years that we can't get it from church. History turned the page. The relationship of the Greek people with this church is not what it used to be over the past centuries, and we cannot define what will be in the future. We feel that there's a gap, as if the church stopped fulfilling the traditional, from national tradition, historical aim, the aim of being powerful and having struggled for the freedom of the nation without having cleared what the church's mission will be from now on. So, today's difficulties, the awkwardness on one hand and disappointment on the other. And he closes his paragraph, no matter how our church is connected with the state, if we go back to the sources and be true to ourselves, we should agree that the original internal destination is not to save a nation, but every nation, that is, every human being. The order was given very clearly, that never gave any space for objections. We respect our history. Historical needs forced the church to take this course over the last centuries. We honor the action and the sacrifices of the church, but now that historical conditions have changed, he writes back in 1965, it's time to have the clear word of the gospel. This doesn't mean that the church will show any indifference for the people surrounding her. It would be something not understandable, even more since the people are integral part of the church. Therefore, the church should help everyday people in their everyday lives. But what greater help can the church offer to the people but through the actions and the work that the church does, so that the people will become more willing to coexist, more free from malice and dark group egoisms. Thank you. Thank you, Father Theodosios, the first presenter in today's round table. Let me remind for everyone that participates in our meeting that it's under the topic Greece and Orthodoxy in 2040. It's the third round table that is under the title Secularization of the State and Society and the Witness of the Church. Father Theodosios gave us elements of what the Church is. We went through a historical overview of how the Church worked back in the Ottoman occupation. But he also presented us the present and the responsibility that has to be undertaken by the Church in today's era, with everyday changes. He's indeed most times very honest, all times very honest, and he was very careful in highlighting how to bring back the gospel of Christ to every person. And the question that we have, how we will, and the main question, how we will be able to coexist with everyone in this place within the next 40 years. The second presenter, Dr. Aris, Stylianou, professor at the School of Political Sciences, the Faculty of Economic and Political Sciences at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. We wholeheartedly thank him for being today with us. Your Eminence, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to wholeheartedly thank the organizers of today's roundtable for the honoring invitation to participate in this very interesting discussion. Additionally, I feel the need to congratulate the Academy of Theological Studies of Volos for the very useful initiative to organize 4 roundtables of dialogue that investigate the crucial issue of the shaping of modern Greek identity in Greece of today and tomorrow, on the occasion of the bicentennial anniversary of the Revolution of 1821. Recently, in the current year, there have many important researchers have been published for the importance of 1821, and also many interesting articles have been published. We could also implicitly say that despite the difficult conditions of the pandemic, it has opened and continues a broad discussion, an open dialogue, like those that we very seldom manage to have in our country. Indeed, 200 years afterwards, it seems that there is the instance for an essential and sober review of the course up to today of modern Greek state. We could say that incongruous populations that lived in the broader Greek area under the Ottoman occupation managed to have a victorious revolution, creating a nation and people, and constituting a state that endured through many and dangerous tribulations. Not only endured, but also became more strong and doubled in its area within 100 years. The tribulation continued without any ceasing, although in the last 50 years, Greece functions in conditions of stability with an institutionally safeguarded political system of constitutional democracy. It is common ground that the revolution of 1821 had a very crucial European international dimension, that it had a national but also social character, and its orientation was mainly radically democratic and secondarily liberal. Maybe for this reason, liberalism could neither root nor establish here in Greece. Summing up, we are not dealing with 200 years of solitude and a brotherless nation, not with the so-called individuality of the Hellenism of the East, but with a modern European state, with both its good and its bad, its ups and downs, its successes and its failures. Further than these reviews, of course, it is the time today for a reflective and visionary programming regarding the future of our country, the immediate, but also the distant one. Of course, as it has been shown through the historical experience, what the future holds remains dubious, and whoever believes that can foresee those falls into an illusion. In any occasion, this ascertainment does not stop us to plan the future, moving and review considering whenever it is needed. In this perspective, it's very crucial the notion and its practical application of secularization of the state and society in a harmonious combination with the witness of the Church and the Orthodox tradition, as it is the title of today's round table. Taking for granted the austere dedication of our country's constitution, we have to define anew the distinct roles between the state and the Church, guaranteeing in practice the proper function of a contemporary European neutral religious state, with devout care for human rights, individual and political, with a deep faith in democracy and popular sovereignty, but also with true respect to the special characteristics of the Greek society. For that, it would be hopeful to draw a roadmap, in quotes, a roadmap for the distinction and the separation of state and church. This roadmap should be European and democratic. According to my view, it could be inspired by the positive and negative experiences of the French model, a secular or a popular state, that is what is the so-called laïcité. However, it should be attempted a reasonable and creative adaptation of this model to the facts of today's modern Greek society. As it is known, the French model is connected closely with the legacy of the movement of the Enlightenment, as well as with specific historical developments. Under this perspective, the most important historical event was, of course, the French Revolution that shaped modern Europe and the great ideological and political trends that were developed, survived, and managed to survive up until our days, as is conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, among others. Despite its positive and fruitful contribution, as an emancipation of human, as people's exit from their maturity, from the maturity that was responsible for themselves, according to the definition of Kant, Enlightenment certainly included some unthoughtful and naive optimistic aspects. This fact led to some philosophers after the Second World War and the Holocaust to talk about a negative dialectic of the Enlightenment. Taking into consideration the limits of Enlightenment, on the basis of the historical experience of the 20th and also the 21st century, we are in position to define anew the framework of the secularized society in which we live and we are about to live in the near future. An element of the French tradition that should be rejected is the intense anti-clericalism. In general, doctrinisms, fanatisms, and fundamentalisms have no position in a contemporary democratic society. Tolerance and respect of every person's opinion, opposite opinion and disagreement, is a one-way street for the harmonious social coexistence. We have realized in the hard way that every attempt to limit the freedom of thought, of belief and expression brings about great distractions and leads to the opposite from what is aspired direction. Therefore, no, there shouldn't be any oppression of religious freedom of spirit, and broadly freedom of thought, expression, and self-definition of peoples. In a democratic state, respecting the other is essential, respecting the different is essential, respecting the minorities, no matter how small they are, always within the framework of the laws and the proper function of the state regime. As Spinoza wrote, it's impossible for the soul of a person to depend completely on another person. No one can give to the other person the ability to think freely and assess all things, nor can it be forced to do that. So that this is why an authority is considered violent when it attempts to oppress the souls, and this is the state oppresses people when the state wants to dictate to each and everyone what should accept as true and reject what is false, and according to which doctrines people's souls should so express piety towards God, because all this is each one's right that cannot denounce even if people wanted to. End of quote of Spinoza, 1670, in the Netherlands of the era. According to all of the above, let's talk about today's Greece, that we can see many distortions in the relations between the state and the church. According to my view, I would like to say that many state and administrative functions are interlaced in a confusing and at least secular manner with the church and worshipping processes. These distortions need to be fixed, and the safest way to do it is a consensual divorce, in quotes, between the state and the church. Of course, I know that things are more complex, and I hesitate somehow to support that the Church of Greece should stop being, for example, public legal entity, or that the priests should stop being public servants. If even if all of this can be put under discussion and change with understanding, the way it happened 3 years ago with the agreement of the then Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras with the Archbishop of Athens Hieronymus for the church state and the payments of the clergy. Irrespective that the fact that this agreement was never completed. I mean that the relations between church and state can be regulated starting from the self-evident and simple things. Let us say with a guide, whatever was legislated back in 2000 and created great disruption regarding the display or not of religion on identity cards. I believe, for example, that the religious oath has no use in state functions and administrative ceremonies, and this is why it should be abolished or be drastically limited. This way of overuse of abuse, the abuse is instrumentalizes the gospel of as the word of God is rendered cheap. Obligatory participation in prayer, institutions, a school, or the army is not a good practice. The obligatory display of icons and religious symbols in public buildings does not conform with the facts of a contemporary secular society. In the year 2021, the way I see it is unthinkable that metropolises and the church has to take the duties of a registrar, giving certificates of marriage and divorce. The marriage as an administrative action is a civic union, has to do with the state, and should be political, and should be registered at the municipality. From that point on, anyone can have any form of religious marriage they wish. The same applies for baptism, that should not have a place of name giving. The church is not a registrar office, nor even state public service. The confessional character of the lesson of religious studies in the public school is an erroneous practice that does not contribute to general education of the students, not even to the essential knowledge of Orthodox Christian tradition. I know the problem with the interpretation of the relative constitutional articles, as it's the last unfortunate decision of the State Council for the course for the lesson of religious studies in school. I suggest that we should overcome these unproductive conflicts and see the essence of the teaching of this class. I think that it's no solution to have religious studies as an elective course, neither that the fact that every student who wishes to be exempt, that is, whomever's parents wishes to their children to be exempt. Basic knowledge of the Bible, Old and New Testament, is crucial as historical and cultural tradition, as a culture, if you wish, all around the world, but mainly in Greek and European societies that have been shaped from and with Christianity for thousands of years. A presupposition for a constructive teaching of Christian religious tradition is that the class, the course, does not have a confessional character, does not constitute catechesis, but to bring out the historical, cultural, and literary dimension of religion, with the presentation of the Greek Orthodox tradition, of course, but at the same time with references to other Christian doctrines, as in every other large religions. I could, at this point, we could talk about the multiculturalism notions and non-Christian students, but I don't wish to get into this kind of discussion. Forgive me if I enter strange terms, since I'm not scientific. I don't have any scientific specialization, legal or other, to talk about these issues. I may be wrong, but I've tried to talk simply and truly, expressing the sentiment of a Greek citizen who, throughout his life, stumbles upon in these very strangely intertwined relations of state and state. If we want to live in a contemporary, secularized society, it is time we transform these outdated structures and walk ahead on a more solid ground with under better conditions. So as not to be misunderstood, I don't talk from an individualist position, because we are not made from insulation material. We are not isolated individuals, despite everything that a profane neoliberalism advocates. Human beings are created through relationships on a social manner. Individualism on its own cannot have an autonomous and complete meaning, since everything transforms within the context of a series of changing relationships among people under general terms of communication, that is, within the status of interpersonality that constitutes a dynamic process. Therefore, communal and social relationships are greatly important. It is true that the mentalities and habits may be preserved in long term, but they keep changing and are transformed dynamically. Therefore, we always need to be in position to certain future tendencies that are shaped even today, so that we can plan tomorrow in the best possible way for the benefit of all the citizens, seeking quality of life and essential meaning to life, and with the pursued horizon a better tomorrow for democracy, our society, and our country. Finally, I'm not that naive to think that great breakthroughs and changes can be achieved without restriction, even due to inactivity, for those who may think that they lose some of their small interests, secular powers, political powers, social influence. But I think that it's time to give finally to Caesar what belongs to him and give God what belongs to him. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor and President of Political Sciences at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, Dr. Aris Stylianou. After self-criticism in terms of the clergy from Father Theodosios, we have a critique of modernity from the professor, who talked about, and I have to agree with him, I'm over 60 years, and I stumble upon throughout my life what you mentioned. Being born in the church, I keep stumble upon these issues that I hear again and again. Let us hope that there won't be a need for 65 more years for this to change. You spoke about these things that are very crucial and important, and we have the same question. We always have the same question. When will solutions be found? And as you rightly said, we have a peculiarity here in Greece, as you said. Therefore, this is why the French model is not considered as successful, but only as a possibility. Thank you very much. It's a great issue, but you were very frank about it, and it's very important to have this kind of discussion. We'll continue with Dr. Grace Davie, who's Professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. Your Eminence and ladies and gentlemen, may I say how honored I am to be part of this discussion. I am so sorry that I'm not able to be with you in Thessaloniki. I would very much like to have come, but for reasons of the pandemic and also personal reasons, the travel was not possible. But I hope that you can hear me, and I hope that you will follow what I say. I'm very grateful to the translator for helping me because I have to speak in English. These are the points that I want to cover in my discussion this evening. I want to say just one word or two in a moment about my own position and what I can bring to the debate. Then I want to talk a little bit about the religious situation in Europe as a whole, both East and West, and its distinctive position in global terms. Europe is not a global prototype. It's a very distinctive case. I will then turn to my own country, Britain, noting the English case in particular, because my observations on the Greek case will, of course, be seen from this perspective. I'm located a long way away from Greece. I have visited and I enjoy my visits very much to Greece, but I'm looking at it from outside. I am trained in social science. I am trained in sociology, and my mentor in much of my work has been the very distinguished scholar David Martin, who taught us that secularization is a process that takes place differently in different societies. There is nothing automatic about secularization. It is present in some modern societies and not in others. In a global perspective, Europe is relatively secular, but we need to be very precise when we talk about secularization. It's not a general process that is always the same. As I say, the European case is notably more secular than the rest of the world. And East Orthodox Europe, your part of Europe, is different from the West, both Catholic and Protestant. But within each of these blocks, there is very considerable variety between the nation states that make up these various parts of Europe. We've heard just in the previous presentation a little bit about the French case, which I know relatively well. The British case, and I will speak in particular about England, is different again. In what I say now about 21st century Europe, I'm drawing on a new book that I have co-edited with a Romanian scholar, a scholar of Orthodoxy, Lucian Leuștean. It's the Oxford Handbook on Religion in Europe, which will be published later this year.
Έχω μια πρόταση για όσους
And as
τυχόν
we
δεν
put
ακούνε
this
τα
together, and
αγγλικά,
it's a
να
very
βάλω
big
να
volume
ακούγεται το
which
ελληνικό.
starts at the beginnings of Europe and goes right up to the present day. But the final section of the volume contains 13 case studies, either nation states or clusters of nation states. And what you see is a very clear pattern across all these case studies. At one and the same time, European societies are experiencing both increasing secularization, there's no doubt about that, but at the same time, growing religious diversity. Interestingly, the former, increasing secularization, is increasingly pervading private as well as public life. But growing religious diversity has brought religion and debates about religion back into the public domain. That was not anticipated by the early theorists of secularization, who felt that religion would endure in private life and not in public life. Belief could be retained by the individual, even if institutionally societies became more secular. Now, societies can become institutionally more secular, but all European societies have to confront religious diversity, and this is not something they find easy. Each nation state confronts what is a testing, demanding combination very differently, and the differences are not simply random. What happens depends very largely on the historic settlement of church and state in that place. So the particularities of the Greek case that we've just been hearing about are very relevant to this debate, completely different from the French case, which was also introduced, and different again from my own society, to which I will now turn for a few minutes. Britain is complicated because it's more than one country or more than one section of what is called sometimes the United Kingdom, if you include Northern Ireland, more commonly Britain, which is England, Scotland, and Wales. Now, England, the established church in England is Anglican, but for centuries, this sits alongside significant minorities. The Catholic minority had a hard time for some centuries, but it never entirely disappeared. And from the mid-19th century, it is an important element in English society, as indeed are a series of smaller Protestant Reformed churches. The Anglican Church is, of course, a hybrid, sometimes described as a Catholic structure with a Protestant theology. Scotland and Wales are different again. I'm not going to explain the detail of those, but simply accept relative diversity from an early stage for centuries rather than decades. Secularization is relatively advanced in all three countries, England, Scotland, and Wales, far more advanced than it is in Greece. Post-1945, as the economy was growing in the post-war period and there were shortages of labor, Britain, like France, like the Netherlands, and to an extent like Germany, looked elsewhere for new sources of labor, and Britain looked to her former empire. This means that we have significant numbers of Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims from South Asia, from the subcontinent, who've been part of British society, English society now, for 4 generations. Don't forget as well the influx of Christians from sub-Saharan Africa and the West Indies. If you look for signs of vitality in the religious scene in England, you will find it amongst migrant, immigrant communities. More recent arrivals in the last decade or two are more diverse in provenance. A number have come from the Middle East and North Africa. On the whole, Britain is a relatively tolerant society. For me, it's a sadness that that tolerance is diminishing. And you see increasingly negative reactions to in-migration in parts of Britain. This is always more difficult when there is shortage of jobs, shortage of housing, shortage of school places. When we need labor, things are easier. When the economy is buoyant, things are easier. When the economy is shrinking, things get more difficult. There is absolutely no doubt that the episode known as Brexit in Britain was brought, I'm sad to say, some of the worst instincts of our country to the fore. And the desire to control immigration undoubtedly played a major role in the debate. This was partly a question of timing because the referendum took place in the year following the sharp rise in migrants arriving from the Middle East, which peaked in 2015. That said, Britain was much less exposed to these flows than the Mediterranean countries. But those advocating a departure from Europe, those people who wanted Brexit, argued for Brexit, were able to exploit an unease felt right across the continent. Brexiteers argued strongly for greater control of our borders. And just as a postscript, I will tell you that if you look carefully at the voting patterns of that referendum in 2016, you will find disproportionate numbers of Anglicans, of members of the Church of England, that title is important, voted in favour of Brexit. And that is particularly true of those who are not practicing, who say they are members of the church, but do not attend or necessarily believe its theology. That was true of the population. It is much less true of the leadership of the church. If I look at Greece from a British perspective, you are, of course, in Greece, firmly located in the Orthodox world with a rather distinctive, very different understanding of church and state from that which I see here. The Greek Orthodox Church remains much stronger than its Anglican equivalent, enviably from the point of view of some Anglicans, and plays a far more developed role in Greek society. There's no doubt about that. The presence of the Greek Church is much stronger and much more evident in daily life in Greek society. I also observe that migration came later and faster than it did in Western Europe. In one relatively recent decade, Greece moved from being a country of emigration to one that found itself on the receiving end of considerable numbers of migrants. And there is no equivalent to that decade in Britain. Britain, the process was longer and slower. Just as an aside, I have reflected quite a bit in my work on the advantages of a weak established church. The Church of England is unable to dominate in any sense in English society. It simply does not have the capacity to do so. That said, it is able to do a number of things which I think are valuable. One of these is to ensure that there is a place, a space, if you like, in our society in which faith is taken seriously, in which debate about moral, ethical, political issues from the point of view of faith communities in general is honored and encouraged. As I said, the established church is not able to dominate this debate, but it still has the capacity to enable that debate and to insist that it happens. What is called the convening power of the established church is still very developed. If a bishop invites his colleagues from other churches, they nearly always respond positively. That happens at national level, and it happens in various dioceses as well. So as we look forward in both Greece and Britain, I see very similar challenges. Both countries, nonetheless, must seek solutions within the parameters set by their respective pasts. You can't ignore your past. You can't set it aside and start again. You have to work in the parameters that brought you to the place where you are now. And they are different in each case, as they were different still in the French case. Both Greece and Britain must avoid the temptations of populism and to retreat into themselves. Specifically, both must resist the temptation to appropriate, or more accurately, misappropriate their respective versions of Christianity, using this to exclude rather than include, and to deter rather than to welcome the stranger. In many parts of Northern Europe, it is alarming, in my mind, and here I include Britain, that there is a very secular appropriation of Christianity to keep people out, to say people are not welcome, instead of the gospel imperative, if you like, to welcome the stranger. I'm struck that both a weak church, a relatively weak church in Britain, and I imagine a much stronger church in Greece, have the capacity to act as advocates for the stranger and as providers of their needs. I see this in the debate about migration. Currently, I know that it's not only churches, but churches are very, very active now in trying to find ways to welcome Afghan refugees who have arrived suddenly, ripped out of their own country and are now in Britain. Churches are networks, they are capable of doing a great deal, not necessarily as part of the state, but as part of civil society. Crucial in this activity, I think, is the requirement to see such minorities as a resource rather than a risk. Interestingly, I've just read an excellent doctoral thesis from Sweden, which made this point extremely carefully as the Swedish state negotiated its role in terms of religious minorities. A state that sees minorities as a risk will regulate, control, and exclude. A state that sees minorities as a resource will welcome, involve, and include. I hope that both those things can happen as we look forward in the British case and as you look forward in the Greek case. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very pleased to have been with you for a short time.
Thank you, Dr. Grace Davie. I have the feeling that she has shown us that there are differences between the eastern and the western side of Western Christianity and Orthodox Church. It's obvious that even in secularized Britain, there is still an issue of the role of the Church. What I keep is that finally that the religious phenomenon has not subsided as it was expected during secularization, but it was brought about. Religions became a first page in the newspapers. This was something that was not expected. This happened without being expected. As a result, both laicite and secularization in Britain to face an unexpected event that they have to deal with. She seems to know very well things in Greece, and it's very encouraging that moving towards an era of migration that will become even stronger next years. How will churches deal with this issue? It's a question that was posed in previous roundtables as well. We'd like to thank her. She posed important issues, and she showed us that it's not just a Greek issue to talk about state and church relations. We move to the final presentation of this roundtable. Dr. Kalaitzidis. I have to admit that I don't dare to restrict your time. I have always been a student of the Volos Academy for Theological Study because I keep learning things from the academy. All these years with Dr. Kalaitzidis as its director, for me it was a very important school of dialogue experiences, people's meetings, getting together with other people, and I'm grateful to God. I may have the burden of the creation or being the president of the board of directors, but it also functions with the participation with professors from Athens and Thessaloniki, but the soul is always Dr. Kalaitzidis, but who also knows that has a board of directors that can do the best every time. I remain a student of this. Dr. Kalaitzidis, His Eminence was not a very good student at university. We were studying together with Father Theodosios. Your Eminence, thank you for your nice words, and also because you explained to people that may hear us for the first time how academy works. It's not just a work of one man, it's an exchange of ideas and enrichment of Your Eminence, dear fathers, dear friends of the Volos Academy for Theological Studies, dear my title is the ghost of secularization and the witness of the church in contemporary world. And I'll start by saying that a ghost is hovering over Christian Europe for many decades, Western and Eastern, as over America, the ghost of secularization. Let me highlight here the ambiguity of the notion secularization. Being used, this term by in a theological context receives negative connotations and suggests the intrusion of the secular spirit in church, the substitution of the church from the secular mentality. If the term is being used in social sciences, it gets a positive connotation and points towards the emancipation of societies from every religious influence and custody. In our discussion, secularization points us to the transcendence of the capitulation between church and the empire that begins with Constantine the Great and reaches its peak with the Great Theodosios and Stylianou, when the political power of Byzantium is sanctified with the formulation of the theory of symphony, as it has been highlighted by historians and theologians. The Byzantines believed that for the state and the society that it was constituted the realization of the kingdom of heaven on earth. On this undivided political theological scheme that seems to forget the distinction between secular and religious sphere that is introduced by early Christianity, the emperor was in the form and place of Christ, and his kingdom was the reflection of the heavenly kingdom. The same seems to be forgotten by the secular and the religious sides, that is, that the secularization is unthinkable without Christianity and the distinction of religious and secular sphere, God and Caesar, and how it is introduced. According to the insightful observations of the French Orthodox theologian Olivier Clément, in the discussion with the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomeus, and I quote, secularization is daughter of Athens and at the same time of Jerusalem. It would be wrong and a dangerous mistake to see only the negative aspects of secularization and denounce them, and just to dream a new Christianity. In the secularized world that will last, even as a simple fort against the intrusion of fanatisms, one can find several traces from the Greek and biblical traces. The respect to the other, freedom of spirit, anything, the best that pluralistic democracy has to show can find their roots in the biblical revelation of the person and the distinction made by Christ between his kingdom and the kingdom of Caesar. End of quote. I would dare to add that the serious theological thought, as such as Clément, bloomed especially in secularized societies in France, Britain, Germany, the United States, and almost never in autarchic traditional societies or religious regimes. The example of theologian of the Russian diaspora seems to affirm this unusual claim. It's not something that can go unnoticed that this theology gave the first fruits to France and then to the United States, that is the most secularized environments. The current issues that are related with secularization and the relations of church and state in Greece are traced back to loose ends and addictions that were given down to us by the Byzantine Symphony, but also the Turkish occupation, when some way the Ecumenical Patriarchate became an institution of the Ottoman state system, taking nation-leading and political duties, and when the Church had to move away from its main mission, dealing with issues foreign to its nature, as is the preservation of race, language, national cultural identity. Father Theodosios mentioned something in his beginning. It is impossible to understand the reactions and the logic that is found on the basis of the argumentation of many members of the ruling church if we don't know and we don't understand what happened that period. Crucial issues, such as the one of church property or the claim of political or even national leading role on behalf of institutional church, this is where their beginning is traced and this is where they can be explained. It's obvious that church has to be relieved from all the burden bestowed on her by the idealization of the Byzantine Symphony and its national leading role during the Turkish occupation. The church cannot respond to the challenges of secularization, of pluralism, of modernity and postmodernity, with the answers of the past and with the idealization of outdated cultural shapes, or through the defense of supposed Christian civilization. Every Christian word is used in quotes, a Christian society and a Christian state or homeland. In other words, with making sure we have an absolutely Christian place would represent a radical denial of the utopian character of the eschatological future dimension of Christian faith as the reversal of the Pauline world. But we are citizens of heaven, as a Johannine affirmation that my kingdom doesn't belong to this world, as it would seek to delimit the kingdom of God in a certain state or certain location. Christian God is a God outside any domain, a God outside of locations, homelands, any political or secular duties that, according to the clear reference in the New Testament, falls into the hands of Caesar. Secular intellectuals have, on the other hand, to stop thinking based on vague principles and ideas and approach with fantasy and creation the composite modern Greek reality, which in many points is different from the respective Western European and, of course, the French. Both Aris, Stylianou, and myself have spent many years in France, but this doesn't mean that we cannot stand critical towards the French model. Aris is maybe less critical, I may be more critical. That is, the French model pushes outside every form of religious expression in private sphere, the moment that today the international philosophical political discussion places religion not in the private but in the public sphere, a public sphere that is not identified with the state sphere. How fitting is the model of radical separation with our case, and how can it be the base of the discussion for a new regulation on the relationships, on the relation between state and church, the moment that this model has points of crisis, that is the French model, if we take into consideration the fact that there are other models in Europe, apart from France, that there were more. If we also take into consideration that there were more enlightenments or more than modernities, multiple modernities, with certain differences regarding the relation of enlightenment and regarding the position of religion in the public sphere, or even when we think the consequences of the discussion for the post-secular society introduced mainly by Habermas. It's not a random thing that, apart from France, every other European country has one form or another of cooperation between state and church, state funding from the church, or even the clergy belonging in the payroll that is undertaken by the state, or even the religious education in secondary education. Greece is not the only country in Europe that the state has an official church, as His Eminence Ignatius mentioned in an interview, and I quote, "In this great family of European countries that is a majority, Greece belongs as well. We are not a European exemption, but belong in the European canon." Regarding the relations of church-state, as every European country has systems of relations that respond to the historical course and the special conditions. End of quote. Even practices as the formal sanctification of the parliament with the presence of the Archbishop and the Holy Synod in the beginning of every parliamentary period, a practice even with practices as the official sanctification of the parliament with the presence of the Archbishop during every parliamentary period, a practice which I personally disagree radically for ideological reasons and also for reasons of aesthetics and respect of the religious freedom. This practices could be mutandis mutandis, to find their respective in the prayer that is recited by a religious practice or official in the American Congress in a country with a radical separation of church and state. That is the wall of separation. Regarding the northern countries, although the official church exists only in Denmark, the Lutheran Church, it should be noted that powerful legal and political connections exist in all of these countries. In Finland, a small Orthodox church is recognized for historical reasons as one of the two national churches. Everywhere in these countries, there is a state funding of the churches, and there are recognized religious communities, or they're funding through the state taxation system and the registration of the people of faith. In secularized Sweden, where it's official, the state of separation exists, the government has established a national council of the recognized religious communities with corresponding state funding, while theological schools, as well as ecclesiastical seminars, receive state funding, but also very austere evaluation processes. In Finland, finally, despite the typical separation of state and church, the parliament has to approve the documentation of the recognized churches, the Lutheran and the Orthodox. In any case, all these countries with systems of mild separation of church and state, as those that I've described, with funding churches through the state taxation system, or with a multi-confessional class of religious studies, apply systems of recording of religious beliefs with very austere, strict rules of saving all this sensitive data. Under the light of all of the above mentioned, the obvious question that comes is why for all these cases nobody mentions for middle-aged practices, for violation of religious freedom, or for conflicting to the European legislation practice of keeping personal data, a register of personal data with the expression of religion, while these accusations are turned against Greece. We should also highlight here at this point that although it may sound as a paradox in Greece, in some aspects, in some issues, there is a greater degree of secularization in comparison to countries as Germany, Austria, Belgium, Luxembourg, Finland, when it comes, for example, to the lesson of religious studies. In our case, the responsibility for this lesson regarding the content, the program, the curriculum, and teaching people is in the hands of the state. The same applies to theological schools of Greek universities. Slowly but steadily stop their confessional orientation, while for the election and the appointment of their professors, they do not have to receive the approval of local bishop, as it happens in Germany, in Austria, even in Romania or Serbia. So if we turn back to the French case, the French nation state and the French laicite, they were created through the breach with the Roman Catholic Church and the eviction of religion from the public sphere, while pushing it into the sphere of the privacy. In our case, the Greek nation state was constructed with a contribution of clergymen, and starting with the revolution of 1821, that had, among other things, the characteristics of a people's religious movement that rendered the church de facto and later de jure an agent of public sphere, subjugated and totally dependent on the state after the regulation of the autocephalus of the Greek Church. Let us not forget that in order to define who were Greeks, the first national council in Epidavros, in the first constitution of Greece in 1822, uses the expressions Greeks are those who believe in Christ. Even in the beginnings of the 20th century, during the national rivalries for Macedonia, the distinction of Bulgarians and Greeks is again on the basis of religious criteria. Greeks are those who belong to the Patriarchate, the Bulgarians, those who belong to the Exarchate, while an obligatory exchange of population exchange between Greece and Turkey after the defeat of in Asia Minor, the religion was the basis, as it was impossible to define in any other safe way the identity of those populations to be exchanged, as we had many people who were Turkish-speaking and were Orthodox in Asia Minor, and at the same time many Greek-speaking Muslims in Macedonia, Epirus, and Crete. I don't talk about all of the above in order to support the stagnation or perpetuation of a situation, but to display the complexity of issues and the differences of the Greek case with other cases from the Western Europe and the French, and on the other hand, to support the need for creative and prototype synthesis, not just the mechanistic transportation of foreign models. Such a creative and prototype synthesis, I think that it was the new religious studies class 2016-2017, the new program that was characterized from the Institute of Educational Policy and members of the educational community as the most innovative and wholesome educationally, but that unfortunately was annulled following the decisions of the Council of State in 2019. There are not few people, those who supported these changes that were brought about in the last few years in the legislative establishment of measures that promote religious freedom and individual rights. The separation of state and church has already happened without even a revision of the constitution. I'm going to mention a few steps without exhausting them of separation and secularization, removal of religion from the identities, political marriage, political oath, legal contract for cohabitation for heterosexual couples, and in 2008 and 2015 for homosexual couples, adoption for homosexual couples, legislation for cremation, political funeral, annulment of the provisions of praying houses, the building of the Islamic. The crucial question is, what do we seek with this discussion of the separation? The empowerment of religious freedom and human rights, the transcendence of discrimination. Let us not forget that there are countries in Europe that have no separation between church and state and are exemplary in terms of respect human rights, for example, some Scandinavian countries and Great Britain, while on the other hand there are countries with separation systems that oppress human rights. Turkey, Hungary, and Russia are among these countries. Also, what do we seek with this separation? The democratic demand of secularization of institutions and state, or the secularization and dechristianization of religious Greek society? The one does not identify with the other, and it's wrong to think that the separation and further secularization of institutions will bring about limitation of the influence of the Orthodox Church in Greek society. And furthermore, what does it mean, neutral religious state, when it comes to Greece? For example, will the Greek state stop being interested for the ecumenical patriarchate for the issues of Mount Athos, from the oldest patriarchates in the Middle East, for the Greek Orthodox archbishops, dioceses of America and Australia, or even who will next Archbishop of Athens will be? How consistent with itself will a government be that will apply the policy of neutral religious in the internal, while in diaspora will use every metropolis of the ecumenical patriarchate and the old patriarchates in Middle East in order to apply its policies? Following this ongoing dialogue for the secularization and the relation of church and state, one cannot think to the extent that the church in Greece has continued to have social influence, and there can be no modernization in the church without renewal. These changes cannot be brought about without the dialogue of church and state. But neither can happen if the citizens are only interested in finishing off with the church, bringing forward the request for separation without taking into consideration whose hands will institutional church remain and what political orientations will have the last, the church, follow without the institutional break of democratic state. An institution such as the church, this is always the institutional church, is the only institution in the Greek state that was not affected by the change of the regime. It's not famous for its performance in financial management or transparency. It's a great error to divide it from the public sphere and be left outside democratic accountability, and be left outside the framework that guarantees by the democratic state. On the other hand, for the church to be able to talk to the contemporary people and preach the gospel of the kingdom of God, and not in the outdated world of yesterday, is an urgent need for the church to start to realize on its own and not being imposed from outside the reality of pluralism and the completion, the fulfillment of the cycle of the Constantinian period, that is an element of anachronism, deficiency of the prophetic gift, an escape from the history if the church remains to this scheme and pursue a certain specific privileged role. It's an urgent priority, the transcendence of national-centric discourse, the abandonment of every dream of return to the Byzantine theocracy or empire, and the peculiarity of grand idealism of Hellenism in any other anti-modern romantic version of Christian society, in quotes. Theocracy and new modern nationalism is the temptation of orthodoxy, not its true identity, and it's nothing other than secularized versions of eschatology. Therefore, they cannot constitute main discourse of the church. Legislative guarantee of distinction between secular and religious sphere, between Caesar and God, the separation, in other words, of church and state, or the clear distinctive roles of church and state, should be prepared very carefully by both sides, taking care not just to for the state to get rid of the church beaks, but also the church not to surrender itself to the conservative and fundamentalistic elements. In this direction, these should be all preserved by the Charter of the Church of Greece, all the elements that guarantee synodality, even on the level of bishops. It should also take extra care for the essential and all-level renewal of synodality. The parish, bishoprics, for the elevation and the cultivation of theological education among the candidates and practicing clergy, should be adept to the transparency and accountability and the proper management of the church. Your Eminence, dear friends, in the thirst of today's man for life, church can and should answer with the church with her own suggestion of life, with his words of eternal life, and not with the constant invocation of the past and the offering and the struggles of the nation. That is the adoption of ecumenical church discourse, free from constant references to the nation and the state and the general schemes of the Constantine period, is not just a request of authenticity and fidelity towards the Orthodox tradition. It's at the same time is a necessary and urgent prerequisite, an unbreakable condition, so that the Orthodox Church can enter our century and not find convenient refugee in previous eras. Thank you for your attention. I would like to thank the director of Volos Academy for Theological Studies. I would like to thank him for the ghost of separation, for the vision that we hope is not a dream, for the relations of state and church in the future in Greece. Before we move on to the discussion, I would like to thank, first of all, I would like to thank all of you being here. I have to admit that I feel really old. You're all too young for me. Thank you very much. I wish you could all see how many young people are among us today. I would like to thank Agape Elas and its director Manolis Toufexis. I wholeheartedly thank him because he contributed to today's roundtable here in Greece, in this great place. Once again, I'd like to thank him. I would like to thank the interpreter, Paraskevia Arapoglou. My pleasure. I would also like to thank the collaborators of Academy that keep moving between Athens, Volos, Thessaloniki, and Alexandroupolis next week. Of course, the technicians that are today are here with us. The internet helps so that we can have this overcome the obstacle of distance, and you can all participate in this event. The conclusions of these roundtables that will be completed next week in Alexandroupolis will be texts included in the White Bible, and this whole effort will be presented in Zapion on the 19th of October. Our effort, I hope, that will be fruitful and will reach that point, but for us more important is this dialogue and this discussion that we have, like the one we had today in here. You have the floor. You can ask questions, but I would please like to make clear questions so that we have the chance for more people be able to ask.
Και το όνομά σας αν θέλετε και εφόσον το επιθυμείτε βέβαια και κάντε μας την ερώτηση.
My name is Nikos Gounas. I have a question for Mr. Stylianou. I have a question for Mr. Stylianou. You talked about against the display of religious symbols. So if I understand, you disagree with the annulment of religious symbols in the public sphere. And Mr. Kalaitzidis talked about the biblical foundation of secularization. I don't think that there can be no mention, apart from what Jesus said about Caesar and God, for the example of Apostle Paul, that clearly said that he was a Roman citizen, and on the other hand, he clarifies that the ethical suggestions in his epistles refer to the members of the church and not for every citizen, saying at the same time that they can have relations with non-Christians irrespective of their ethics, which may come in opposition with the fundamentalism. There will be a first series of questions if you want, so that presenters can collectively respond to your questions. Is there anyone else wishing to ask a question? You're such a great audience. But I have a question to ask. So, thank you for the question, and I also like to thank every other participant here because I learned many things about here. These issues are very complex and complicated regarding icons and religious symbols. I'm not iconoclast, but as you know, in our country there is an abuse the way I see it, in many public buildings and schools, there is this tradition, this, this tradition that is something like an abuse. And since since now we have a multicultural society with migrants, with people, so I think that we need to find some sort of measure, a middle way. I don't think that should be removed from every place, but I think we have to find the middle way. And I agree with many things I heard by Pantelis, but in Greece, and for many years, there's an imbalance of the state church when it comes to the public and state and political processes. This is why we need to find a balance and try. Lenin said that if a stick is bent, in order to make it straight, you have to turn it upside down so that it becomes straight again. This is what I wanted to say. I know the dangers and the difficulties, but we have to find a balance. This is a very difficult issue. And regarding Apostle Paul, you were right that Paul was an amazing personality. He invented this ecumenical, this Catholicity. Is the most. Paul is responsible for spreading the word of Christianity. I will focus on the second part of your question. There was a paragraph in my presentation that I removed in order to keep in time. In which paragraph? Up until the 4th century, Christianity was not asking to impose its principles to those who were not members of the Eucharistic gathering. Therefore, we go once again back to the crucial point of the Constantine period. Maybe some people think that this critical comes from Protestant inspiration. This is wrong. Of course, there is this criticism from the Protestant tradition, but there are important Orthodox theologians such as George Florovsky that talks about the tragic failure of Byzantium to fulfill what had said as a main goal, the kingdom of God on earth. The kingdom of God on earth is not fulfilled in its wholeness because we as Christian and as Orthodox, we are turned towards eschaton. This is where things change and the church asks to impose all these characteristics even to those who were not members. What Grace Davie said, not to just when she said that those who voted for Brexit was in the name Anglicans only, but on not practicing Anglicans. That had no essential relation with their faith. And I'm afraid with phenomenon like that we have in our country as well. We have a form of orthodoxy that calls for traditions, the church father tradition, the orthodoxy, and forgets the gospel. A Christianity that, if we want to remember Dostoevsky and the question, do you believe in God? I believe in Orthodoxy, I believe in Saint Russia, and to the question, do you believe in God? The response is, I will believe. I believe with what I said, I respond to with what I said, I respond to the issue of the symbols. I agree with Aris that we have accepted many symbols. Our life is full of symbols. Managing these symbols is a very difficult issue. And from what one believes up to what one has to do, there's a great distance in between. And once again, I will ask you to be cautious. I don't like this symbolic Christian as the sanctification in the parliament, but there's also the danger that some other people will come up in authority, and these other people, like the extreme right, will take advantage of the elimination of the symbol or the abolishment of morning prayer. It's a very difficult issue, church. I'm not just talking about Christianity, Orthodox Church and other Christian churches. But in our country, this question has to do with the Orthodox Church. We'll go through a form of secularization. We'll know the result and the consequences of secularization. This happened already in Europe and the States. We as Orthodox Christians haven't met this essentially. We do not witness the emptying of churches and a lesser influence of the church. Therefore, this will not happen to the extent that took place in Europe and America. But there will be such a phenomenon, and it will be good as Orthodox Christians to be prepared with everything that I mentioned, and not think that this traditional relation will be forever. It will be different from what it was in Europe and the States. But the most important thing is not, again, it's very important what Grace Davie said. The most important factor is not the power, but the fidelity of the gospel. Thank you very much, Father Theodosios. I basically agree with everything that has been mentioned. I have an anxiety that the separation of state, the objection of the clergy to the separation, is an anxiety that will have less respect in the public sphere. And sometimes all these public symbols in the sanctification of the parliament, or who is present in public ceremonies, is very funny, but it's something that we are preoccupied with. It's a matter of authority, prestige, but as well as an anxiety that has to do with our payroll. The Catholic Church has a concordat with the state. The first year of every decade, they review everything that has been left out, and they re-include it, and then they are free. The church is free to announce, for example, the Pope, the new Bishop of Palermo. Separation does not necessarily mean an argument, an intense argument. The limits have to be really clear. The fact that our society has been Christianized, no matter how we think of populations as Christian, but it's a reality, but will not move further. It will be very difficult, and COVID will find us with far fewer people in the churches, even when COVID is over. As for the symbols, rather than being a symbol of a reducing symbol, it's something like a motif. A person that is disabled after an accident is hired at the municipality office. It's very, and the person working right next to him, with his office full of icons, does not work consciously. Then the disabled person was so overwhelmed that told his fellow working person, just remove your icons because your laziness makes them look bad. The issue of icons, now with COVID, everyone screams that we will not show respect to the icons. The icons have turned into a fetish. rather than being a window opening us towards heavens, but as the clergy never help them understand that Greeks are baptized, but they're not Christians. It's one thing, and the other is another. The bishop, I've been a priest for 41 years, but if you think that this piety nation has a large percentage of Christians, is illusioned. And the strange thing now is I live in Demetrias for 23 years. I lived in Athens, in Piraeus. I never liked the sanctification in the parliament. But now I'm a bishop. But there is no provision for the oath-taking of the municipal and the mayors by the bishops. But on the other hand, this oath-taking is not prohibited clearly. But then again, every mayor has asked me to go through this process of oath-taking. It's not something that has to be done, but sometimes it may be that this ceremony would be without any meaning. And please tell me, what should I do? Should I ask the mayor, do you believe or not? But he's the only mayor that he said that had, why do I fund sport groups? Can't I give funds to the churches as well? I'm saying all this because it's very easy to see the whole image. Observe something else. Have you seen what's the case with these pre-constructed small chapels? I would like for the state to ban these constructions. Everyone feels the need to have a small chapel in his property. You see, the things are not so simple. We'll remove the symbols, as you say, but try to remove all these small crosses on the sideways of the roads. What I'm trying to say is that Greece is used to all of these. And of course, a student in school cannot see the cross or the chapel on the side of the street and not know what this is. Students should be taught these things, as the Greek student should learn what the Muslim does when Muslims kneel and pray. This is my question. If we see Greece in 20 years, of course the others will be here. You say that a Greek father won't feel the need to take the child to go to take their children and take it to the church if the mosque is right next. No matter if parents believe it or not, they will do that. Take their children to church and not the mosque. I was in Damascus during the Great Lent. Every night, every church was full of people. And my thought was that not even during the Holy Week, the church was not that full. The response was that the mosque was full, so we should be. What I'd like to say is that things, I'm not sure that they will lead to a secularization, that the people of faith will be lost. There is also the view that if we are right, and this is where this dialogue should take place, that people need to be united. Because I'm asking you to show to me another unifying institution. What connects us internally? What connects Greeks of diaspora while they work and are integrated, are very dynamic factors in the state, but on Sundays they feel the need to go to the Orthodox Church. I have a feeling that we walk towards that direction. And one last thing, you know that our constitution preserves not only the mainstream religion, but also a church synodality. The professor said that we have the best synodal church in the world. Also, the constitution preserves the relations of the Church of Greece with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. If this changes, we have a huge issue. For better or worse, the revolutionaries of 1821 laid the foundation for the faith of Christ, and at the same time, the developments made the Greek state a guarantee of unity between the Church of Greece and the Ecumenical Patriarchate. That needs to remain the same. Only the Greek state can do that. You understand that behind the word separation, there are things and events that can contribute on national division. And I would like to close up with this. I have a feeling that separations that were caused by and had national losses as well, almost always started by religious separations and with a upbringing in the Venizelos period. Remember how the church was divided, even with the issue of Cyprus. Remember, first we had the church division of Cyprus, and then we had the separation of Cyprus. I say all these things because I think that we need to contribute with this dialogue and in keeping a unity that is much needed by our people and our country. This means readiness, dialogue, what we do, what we can do, and every time, as Dr. Kalaitzidis said, and Father Theodosios, we should also be self-critical and the possibility to be preachers of the gospel, while on the other hand, be people that will be united, people that have faith and feel safe with their faith, will never be entrapped by racism. People that will lose this unifying power will be vulnerable and will give room for some people that will be very dangerous and will take in their hands what church is. Thank you very much. I agree with most of the things you said, and many of these I also presented, but I have to highlight, to note, that this is a sign of a church's weakness, not power. That is, a church that is in need of the state so that it remains united. A church that needs the constitution and the establishment of the presidential decree so that it remains synodal, shows that it has many problems of self-understanding and identity. I would also like to remind something that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. Apart from the sociological aspect of secularization, there is also the theological interpretation of secularization, the invasion of the secular spirit and mentality in the church. Aris Stylianou mentioned in his presentation the example of baptism, that baptism should not be name-giving. This does not apply. Greeks can be by birth. Why this doesn't in practice apply, typically listening to what Stylianou said about baptism, I thought about what some French theologians said. What is baptism today? It's the first children's party. It has lost its ecclesiastical reference. We don't understand at that point that a new member comes into this church community, and this means that the institutional church should decide what to do. But you have called against us that we don't baptize children in the parish that they're born, because this is ecclesiologically based, because you belong to a parish. Because we deny to baptize children away from the parish. Children should be baptized in the parish that they belong, because they become members of this parish. It was very difficult for this to be understood, but it was supported by my priests. Let's see what the next bishop will do. You see that many things are very personal. As for example, we have double sacraments. Baptize a child when people are getting married. You say no, but then people will find another parish. We show our internal problems, because to show that as a church we try to act regularly, and the people keep changing, have different understandings. Now many people have a political marriage first, and then because the religious marriage is very much more expensive. Because we mentioned political marriage many times. Papadiamandis, a writer, he was a son of a priest. When he was 45 years old, suggests that political marriage should be obligatory for every Greek before 1900s. He says that political marriage should be obligatory, and their personal relationship to the church will be personal choice. The registrar's documentation have to be things of the state. The church should have relations with her members. And then we would be able to have some wedding ceremonies that we cannot perform right now. I've mentioned many times that we are restricted by certain legislations. Our previous bishop did 5 marriages because they were not allowed. My own opinion is the obligatory form of political marriage would benefit the church, would help the situation to be clarified so that marriage become again a church function that was taking place in Byzantium. And this is also supported by the Serbian liturgics professor Nando Milosevic. These are suggested by him in his PhD dissertation 20 years ago. One last thing I wanted to say. It was very interesting what he mentioned for the inter-individuality and the relationship, community of relationship, which up to a point remind us of the theology of the person. And this is an example of how exactly, despite our differences, we can meet and get into a constructive discussion. this is what I wanted to highlight, because I believe that it was, whatever has been heard today was very important. At this point, I think that after this constructive dialogue we've had in this round table, I would like to thank you all. Our effort will have our final round table next week in Alexandroupolis, and next we will have this completion of this program. Thank you once again for hosting, Mr. Toufexis. We hope that we have great cooperations, and may God give us a chance to meet again so that we can get into constructive discussions. I think that if it's something we pursue, this is a dialogue, any feeling of unity, always with the way that each and everyone will take and receive. And in this country, we have to keep the value of discussion and dialogue, view and imagine coexistence as Christ wants us. We'll pray for each other, and I wish you all a good fall and a wonderful winter. We continue to be careful, and of course you're all vaccinated. Please convince everybody else. Thank you.